Hello, welcome. All right, so before we leave, please let me know by way of a message or unmute yourself if you're unable to stay for the duration of this, because I'm gonna take roll at the end. Okay, so at any rate, just kind of get a rough number here. This is nice. Okay, good. All right, so looking at this, we are on track. We're far enough ahead, having done two last week, that we could just do one, and this one that we're covering isn't due for another week. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and we're going to cover the Southern Colonies. Okay, so what are some themes that I wanted to touch upon with Southern Colonies? Well, for one, right, is that subsequently you can't help but look to the future, and you look at American rhetoric, and we're so proud of equality of opportunity, right? The American dream, that if you're talented and diligent enough and lucky enough, that virtually anyone can make it, right? That's at least the rhetoric that we like to connect to things Americana. Okay. But here we are, 100 years, over 100 years before that, in the 1640s and 50s, under England. But of course, the English would contend that they have the relative to other royal nations with a constitutional monarchy, that she had perhaps the freest, most opportunity ridden, available empires in the world. All right, that's at least what they would boast. Okay, so you notice that from some time from here until the War for Independence, we're no longer a mercantilist economy, right? So remember, under mercantilism, because it is assumed that there's a finite amount of resources. It is the prerogative of the crown to decide how to allocate those resources. So therefore, what you did for a living depended upon, one way or another, royal permission, especially if it was a big money-making venture, gold, silver, chocolate, sugar, slaves. You had to have some pretty high connections to carry the proper papers to trade in that. And if you didn't, they had their customs collectors, who were like their highway patrolmen across the seas, trying to catch people without papers, which would constitute smuggling, the crime of smuggling, and you'd get in trouble for that, fined and imprisoned. So at any rate, then also, if you wanted to be a skilled worker, an artisan of some sort, you oftentimes had to, back in Europe, you had to join a guild, and the guild had to accept you, right? It was like their own little labor union, and they were often selective in who they would admit into their fold. So you couldn't just choose any profession. It relied in one way or another upon someone else's consent. And that was the mercantilist economy. Then somehow, right, gradually, we kind of organically evolved into an open market, into a capitalist economy, whereby people did what they wanted. They chose what they wanted for a living. They try a business in this or a business in that, and let just supply and demand and all the other laws of economics do their thing, and decide who was going to prevail and who was going to fail. So at any rate, we're kind of in that intermediate stage here. So in the 1600s, when they began to migrate from England into Virginia, into our present day South, right? Because remember, South is Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, okay, along the coast at least. So those are the states we're talking about. And Virginia was kind of the king of those colonies up until arguably up through the War for Independence. As far as number of men, the highest ranking officials, the greatest trade, although they had Charleston and New Orleans to compete with. But at any rate, so what happens? So what I'm saying is capitalism is evolving for better and for worse. Well, why is it for better? Well, for better is there were more opportunities for the poor of England over here in the Americas than there have been previously back in England itself, England proper. So one of the main avenues, right, is you could become an adventurer. A lot of those who, I mentioned this in the Black Legend lecture, a lot of merchants who wanted to double their money, right, they would go to the Christopher Columbuses and say, convince me, where are you going to go? What are you going to get to double my money, for me to invest my money into a ship and soldiers and gunpowder and food and victuals and everything for you? Why do I want to put my money into your venture? And you had to convince them, because these big money makers knew that there over a third of passengers were dying still just trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And so it was a deadly endeavor. They had chroniclers write, especially from Spain, about a lot of dramatic fighting and wars. And so they thought they might get killed by natives, right? They had this popular kind of stereotypical image in their head of how dangerous it would be over here. So they were no dummies. They would just put their money into a joint stock company, and whatever percentage of money that they put into the pool, that's the percentage that they would yield from the profits, right? So you put in 25% of all the money that's invested, then you get 25% of the profits, okay? And you don't have to lift a finger. You can stay in England and stay comfortable. Well, if you're more desperate, if you're poorer, you say, okay, well, what about me? I say, okay, you get to risk life and limb, and then we will treat you hypothetically as if you had put money into the fund, into the joint stock company. And I've just read a couple times, like something as small as like 3, 7, 10% that they might get offered. I'm sure in bigger, more famous cases, they might have been promised higher yields than that. But the point of it is, right, is in reality, they had not put a pence, they didn't put a red penny into it, but they were treated as if they had put between 3 to 10% of the money in, because they're doing the dirty work. They're getting their hands dirty. They're coming here. They're trying to immediately find some form of profitability, something that could yield money to the lenders that lend them that money, right? And then it's kind of a win-win for the crown, because with the crown, you risk your own life, you risk your own money, and it's no sweat off the crown's chin if things go awry for you. But if they go well, then the crown's national flag goes over that, and the crown gets its royal 1/5 portion of all of your yields as your tribute as a colonist. So it was a win-win for these crowns, for these kings and queens back in Europe. So you had this opportunity as a poor person, right? And Captain John Smith was one of them, of Jamestown fame. So you had that. Then you also had what grew into indentured servitude. And with this one, right, they really tried, as demeaning as a situation that some people were in, as demeaning as the manner was by which they took some of them. Some of them, they were literally like shanghaied. They were like kidnapped off the streets, like homeless. They were taken out of prison cells and put on ships and so forth. But then with some, it was absolutely volitional. It was absolutely by choice. And what you would do is anywhere from 3 to 7, 8 years, you would indenture yourself to a planter, to a plantation owner. Okay. So for that duration, for 3 to 8 years, you're his. Okay. He not only can, you're relying upon him for your victuals, for your food and shelter. You have to abide by his work rules. You could be corporally punished, like bodily punished, whipped, etc. You had to have proper papers to leave the plantation at any given time for permission. If you were caught absconding or running away, they would double what was left of your term as punishment and whip you. And oftentimes they fed you just enough to get by. And so a lot of them complained about being malnourished. It was a pretty miserable experience. But the point is, right, is that it was meant to be temporary, right? It was meant to be temporary. So it'd be like someone today doing a degrading you know, just a low socioeconomically esteemed job, but that person is taking online or in person night classes to get his or her PhD, right? Or at least bachelor's degree. You're not planning on staying in that hardworking job, that lowly job, right? It's just a means to an end. And that's how they propagated indentured servitude, that it's your way up, that yes, it's going to be quite miserable, but it's for a finite amount of time. And then when you're done, you are to be promised freedom dues. That is a certain allotment of land, a certain amount of food and victuals. They're supposed to have taught you at least one skilled trade that you could work economically for a living and live off of. And so that tended to happen, according to the primary sources, pretty faithfully in the state or colony of Maryland. Okay. They had a guy named George Alsop and these others who were ex-indentured servants who became rich planters themselves years later. And they became spokesmen for this system and saying how well it worked, how good it was for your character to go through that humility and hard work and rise up. In Virginia, however, they developed quite a more of a negative reputation for their fidelity to their contracts. So a lot of people began to feel disillusioned in not getting what had been promised to them at the beginning of their terms. And those people were encouraged by the crown to head west. And that's why some historians define the West from the colonial times for much longer than that as the safety valve, right? That these people who had high expectations and those expectations were never met, they finished their indentures, that they were going to become a combustible demographic of rebels. And so instead, let them become the headache of someone else, push them west and tell them they could start anew in the West. And it was seen back then as a win-win situation. And we're going to get back to that. So at any rate, you have those processes, right? But then you look at the uglier face. Remember I said for better and for worse. If you were a planter, every indentured servant and or slave, African slave that you brought over, you received 50 to 100 acres of land. Okay, 50 to 100 acres per head, per person. That really adds up if you're already wealthy and you could bring over 100, more than 100 laborers. Right, that adds up quite well. So the wealthier, they have the ability to gain more land, okay, right off the bat through the headright system, being given land per laborer, right? And being there quite early, they're taking the choicest of the land, which was known as the Tidewater region in Virginia. And they were known as the Tidewater elite, all right? So then in addition to that, when the land survey system finally came about and they started surveying the land and auctioning it off, how is a poor person going to outbid a rich person in an auction, in a land auction? That's a rhetorical question. He can't, right? So the wealthy dude outbids you and buys more land. So he was already granted more land on behalf of his laborers. Now he has the money to outbid you to purchase additional land, right? And then what was hard to come by in the early colonial period was credit. Credit was hard to come by. We didn't have much of a banking system at all here, all right? And as some people say, it takes money to make money. If you want to start a business, early on, the American way was usually a cash crop, right? You would decide to farm just one farm product, not to live off of, but to sell for profit and then purchase your needs, right? Well, cash crop farmers, they needed loans for the feed, for the tools, to purchase the land, to outbid someone on the land, etc. and they had to wait for 1 or 2 good yields and harvests to be able to pay that loan back. So not only was it tough to pay back a loan because you were at the mercy of the weather and your crops, but oftentimes you couldn't get the loan to begin with. But guess what? These well-connected men that are coming as plantation owners, they did. They had the bank connections back in England. And the word used for their class of people is gentry, Gentry. So to this day, right, when we say a neighborhood has been gentrified, it is as if that neighborhood, its socioeconomic value has been enhanced, right? So it's gone from like a ghetto to look like a nice white collar environment. So the gentry class were a proud people, okay? And then if that's not bad enough, with the lion's share of land, the lion's share of loans for businesses, look at this. 117 of the 152 members of the Royal Council of Virginia identified with the aristocratic gentry class. They monopolized the highest political positions as well, right? And many of them intermarried. Yes, cousins, married cousins, as you may have read back in Europe. It's called endogamy. Try to make strategic choices of marriage to keep your inner circle as small and tight as possible and keep newcomers from coming in and joining in on that wealth and those privileges. So at any rate, that happens in the South. And then in addition to that, they have a monopoly, or at least a hegemony, a kind of a domination over culture as well. The whole idea of duels, the whole code of chivalry, the noblesse oblige, right? That came from medieval Europe. The gentry class absorbed that very, very stubbornly back in England and brought it over here, carried it to Virginia. So that's why in the South, like your family name, your family honor was everything. You would challenge someone to a duel if your family honor were at stake. So like military prowess, paternalism, right, where big planters acted like father figures to their day laborers and provided for their needs as they exploited them in the fields in their labor. So at any rate, I hope you get why I entitled it that way. So capitalism was starting to open up right off the bat here in America, in the South, but it was for better and it was for worse, right? Some burgeoning, some growing, birthing opportunities for the poor, but the rich still had it a lot better. All right. Because people would admit for centuries that there is kind of a Darwinian tinge to capitalism, kind of a survival of the fittest when the market is open to free competition. All right, and then number 2, this is Helen Roundtree's book, and it's Virginia from the Native Perspective. So this one's pretty cut and dry, right? There are 2 components to it that I want you to remember for the test or your write-up, okay, should you choose this number. It's 1, this is revisionist conflict history, right? This does not praise American winners and leaders, right? This concentrates on conflict and competition for power as the vehicle that pushes history along, right? And then remember, conflict history is the opposite of court history, and that the villains are the winners, and they want to elicit your sympathy, your compassion for the downtrodden, for those who lost in the story. All right. So that's one part of it. And then the second part of it is agency, right? That even if in hindsight, Native Americans made poor decisions, made self-incriminating, self-defeating decisions, they still had the power at that time, right? And Native American intellectuals oftentimes are still okay with that. They wanted just to convey and be reminded that the ball was in their court initially, even if they didn't make the proper decisions. Right? Any questions so far? So those are my main points. So the ugly English imperialist is set up right off the bat, right? Look at their instructions from the joint stock company investors, right? The rich dudes that kept themselves comfortable back in England, but they got to call the shots for the adventurers that were coming over here. They said, before that they, the natives, perceive you mean to plant among them and will grow discontented with your habitation, right? Establish a military fort with an invulnerable facade and take care of your own firstly. So this is the classic ugly imperialist, right? The English, unlike the Spanish on some occasions, there's evidence that they may have genuinely had reason to believe, however naively, that they were going to be embraced open armed by the natives. The English here, they're still in England and they already know, right? They said, okay, things are probably going to be tense right off the bat when you land on there because it's their land and not ours. And as soon as they realize that you're not leaving, that unlike the usual people that show up on the coast, Atlantic coast, from time to time, just to trade, that you, on the other hand, are staying there to cohabit with the natives, they're going to get angry. They're not going to like it. So make sure you build a fort that they can't come against, that's invulnerable, that can't be defeated, and take care of your own firstly. And by no means, under no circumstances, do you trade your gunpowder, your guns with the natives. We have to keep that monopoly. So right off the bat, the English are coming in a spirit of distrust, of rivalry, of competition, right? They're not coming here to win the natives over. They're not coming here for some quid pro quo bargain, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. They're coming to get theirs. And they don't care if the natives like it or not. All right. So they go into territory. And by the way, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I've only read it. So forgive me if I don't do it correctly. But Powhatan was the name of the Confederacy. And he took the name Powhatan as its chief werewants, its head chief. At any rate, he had 24 tribes subjugated to him in this confederation, right? And he was at least, I'm trying to remember the book, but it was at least 25 miles, if not more, inland from where these Jamestown English settlers arrived in the Chesapeake. So when they come in, they go through the Paspahegh territory. And the Paspahegh were subjugated and paid tribute to Powhatan. Well, the English set up a cross, began a prayer over it, and then began having like an anointed ritual whereby it's handed over to the King of England. And remember, Columbus went to an uninhabited island in the Caribbean right before this, claimed it in the name of Isabella and Ferdinand, and waited to hear if there was a response on the contrary. And there wasn't a native there to contest him, he said. So therefore, without contest, that island now belonged to the crown of Castile and Aragon. So kind of similar here, right? That kind of a hubris, that type of arrogance. They're coming in and claiming this land that's not their own. Well, they began to have, through sign language, have trading expeditions, as well as kind of spying expeditions. There were a myriad of small rivers that ran horizontally through, still do, through Virginia. And so they were going further and further inland and trying to just get signs and take note of what tribes might be hostile, what tribes might be willing to trade corn, and also who is the leader around here, right? Well, it happens that the Posbeheg Werewants mini chief, he came to Powhatan, told him about the incident, and the older brother of Powhatan, right from the get-go, this name right here, I'm going to call him Opie Chankano. Okay, that's my best effort. The older brother was a big, strong, physical man. And Opie Chankano, supposedly from the very get-go, according to William Strachey, who was an English hostage taken by the natives and lived with the natives at their capital. According to William Strachey, this guy was a no-nonsense guy, and he wanted to wipe the English out from the very get-go, while they were still small in number, about 110, and just fledgling for food, and in quite a desperate situation right on the coast. Well, Powhatan won't have that. He says, no, I want. I heard that that one of the coastal tribes attacked them, and they had to flee back into their moored ships into the water, and they fired cannon that knocked down trees, and it terrified, the natives. And they said, what are these tools, these weapons that shoot lightning and fire? And so he's already thinking about the Monacans, the Monacan tribe, that are his primary rival. And he's thinking of a military alliance with the English to gain access to their guns. So it wasn't just out of benevolence. Powhatan was a shrewd, sometimes cunning man, okay? But he was the leader of that land long before the English came. And so at any rate, he tells Opie Chankano, do not kill him, but bring him to me. So then you get the account of John Smith himself, which you have to keep in mind, because John Smith seems to brag a bit on himself and perhaps exaggerate his own exploits. But according to his own account, he left two accounts, one in 1610, another one in the 1620s. He stated that he was abducted while they were on a hunting foray. His other men were all killed on the spot. He was dragged to the capital, and they put paint on him. They fed him food, and they began to hit drums and act as if they were going to kill him, beat him, bludgeon his face and head upon a rock. And a 12-year-old daughter of Powhatan, Pocahontas, came forth to spare the life of this 27-year-old man. So some people believe anthropologically that they were never going to kill him, that it was a test of his manhood, of his courage. And we'll never know, probably. But at any rate, he tells them, you are going to be my werewants with the paleface, with the white men. You're going to report to me on a regular basis. I'll send you provisions and corn, etc. And you are going to provide some of those guns to me. And of course, John Smith promises to do such, and then when he leaves, he never does. He never gives them functioning guns. All right. So then things get ugly with trade. They would come and they'd put their weapons in their own canoe. The other side would put their weapons in their canoe. And then in two other canoes, they would put trading goods, and they would walk to the other ethnicities' canoe to see for what goods they would like to have, and then go back to their own and say which one of their own goods they were willing to give away for that, in classic barter fashion. Well, on a couple occasions, the Englishmen were caught and skinned alive and burnt to death. It was called the mitote, M-I-T-O-T-E. And so two men were written down in the English primary sources for that having happened to them. So from that point forward, John Smith starts gaining a reputation because he wasn't, remember, he didn't put any money in. He was just an adventurer. But one after another, the noble leaders who had put money in were showing kind of a lack of just lack of cunning, lack of practical intelligence, and then a couple of them were killed. And so, kind of organically, it grows into more and more people at Jamestown trusting the very cynical and the very kind of pragmatic. Remember, like pragmatic is that you don't worry about what's right or wrong about morality. You do whatever yields the best practical result. John Smith was very pragmatic, and I'm not saying that that is a good thing, but I am saying, according to some sources, that it was a useful thing for the English to stay alive, being so heavily outnumbered. Well, when he didn't bring the guns, Powhatan stopped bringing the food, and they experienced 2 starving times. And during those times, they would send out an expedition of soldiers under John Smith, and they would extort nearby tribes. They would literally threaten to kill them if they didn't hand over so much corn and food. All right. So at any rate, then there finally was an ultimatum given to them not to spread any further inland. And the English broke their promise and continued to squat on land that was not their own. So finally, Powhatan had enough. And so it took from 1607 to 1610, 3 years of tension. It finally broke out into the First Powhatan War. Well, Powhatan dies in 1622, I believe, and his brother Opechancanough takes over. Well, his brother was ready for it. Without any formal complaints or list of grievances to the English at Jamestown, without any ultimatum given to them, Opechancanough had a well-orchestrated series of attacks upon English settlements in Virginia. And according to Alan Brinkley in his textbook, they nearly prevailed. They almost wiped the English out of Virginia in the Second Powhatan War under Opechancanough. All right. So at any rate, the next guy, I kind of blended into it already. I thought, man, this guy has some guts. This is a very politically incorrect thesis, and it wasn't written that long ago. A book called Love and Hate at Jamestown. It's post 2000, and he engages in court history. He praises the winners, and he makes villains of the Native Americans. So on this one, you see a darker side of Powhatan. There was supposedly a religious rite that had been carried out, and they declared a prophecy that his end would come from the east. And so he wiped out the Chesapeake tribe, thinking that the Chesapeake tribe on the east coast of Virginia was what that alluded to. He inherited about a dozen tribes, and he kind of bullied a dozen more. What he would try to do is do the whole quid pro quo thing, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. He would tell them, we have this to offer: protection, etc., food, water, etc. I need your warriors. And that sometimes they would take him up on it. When they didn't, of course, he would threaten to invade them and to wipe them out. And so then he would exact tribute from them as like a conquered people. And like I said, according to even Helen Roundtree, who was very pro-Native American in the prior section in her book, even she makes it clear that Powhatan was not just a naive Santa Claus accepting the white Englishmen in, that he had plans of his own. He wanted those weapons. He was ready to fight against the Monaccans. He wanted to use the English to do so. And, so you kind of, that's just an uncomfortable thing for me when I read books like this, because you know how clearly in the long run the Native Americans were absolutely wronged, dispossessed, marginalized, killed. And so it's a little uncomfortable to read, but I try to show as many sides as I can on these assignments. And so I'm playing devil's advocate here, but it's not my thesis, it's David Price's. It's a summation of his book. So with him, right, he says that Captain John Smith was just what the English needed. They were heavily outnumbered, they were desperate for food, they were surrounded by hostile natives, and that they had to be deceitful at times and promise to give guns, and of course never make good on that promise, right? To keep their monopoly on gunpowder, to sometimes extort, to desperately avoid starving. And so with him, Captain John Smith is the first kind of pragmatic American hero, because unlike back in England, under the mercantilist system, under the patronage system with royalty and nobility, right? You had a formal aristocracy. Aristoi means the best in Greek. So aristocracy literally are like the cream of the crop, supposedly on account of their bloodline alone, right? Of who their ancestors were. So not here, says this author. He says, now this is the beginning of American meritocracy, of Americans rising or falling by their own merit, by what they do or do not earn or deserve. And that John Smith earned it, that he was a man of sagacity. Sagacity is like, as opposed to like having, intellectual tendencies and being, quote, book smart, sagacity is being street smart. You may not be very educated formally, but you could read people, you could read situations, and you're very practical, pragmatic, even cunning when it comes to interacting with fellow man. And he claims that that's just the type of hero that the English needed. So yikes. Yeah, that was interesting. Number 4. This is kind of a blasé thesis, all right? Almost saying as if, hey guys, it wasn't that personal. Slavery was primarily an economic, not a racist decision. Now, as kind of, I don't even know what adjective I would give to that type of thesis. At least try to give it its due. Okay? At least try to give it its due. See the manner by which I try to defend this callous thesis. Okay? So the narrative usually starts with a reminder that the English in the South first, chronologically, tried to use white indentured servants on the fields, right? Then you can go to the court records and you could find a myriad of instances of people absconding or running away, of violent attacks and fights, altercations between the indentured servants and their masters. You have accounts of masters getting infuriated when their female indentured servants became pregnant and they lost their labor during the pregnancy. You have accounts of rebellions as well. And the most famous was Bacon's Rebellion. So all these ex-indentured servants who never received their freedom dues, they began to move into the Piedmont region. All right. So just as Tidewater region right here denotes power and privilege, right? High connections. The Piedmont was the place where the nobodies, those who didn't make it, are trying anew. Right here, Piedmont, in Western Virginia. So when they go there, they almost inevitably go start fighting and having atrocities back and forth with Native Americans, because the Native Americans are on that land first. So the governor, who had encouraged them to move there, right, and get out of his area, and so they don't threaten him anymore, he gives them an ultimatum saying you must not fight with the natives. You must come to terms with them or move on. And the reason was, and everybody knew it, is he had made lucrative fur trading treaties with these tribes. He was making money off them. And he would jeopardize that trade and that income if he had to go to war with them. And wars are expensive. So he's got his militia over on the coast, and he doesn't want to send them into the Piedmont to protect these poor ex-indentured servants that he likely doesn't think much of anyway, and then lose the fur from the natives that they're fighting. So he gives them an ultimatum that fighting against the natives is tantamount to treason. Well, altercations continue until a leader arises in Nathaniel Bacon, and he says, heck with it, guys, let's take the risk. So he raised an ad hoc people's army. They defeated 2 or 3 tribes in battle, and before dissembling, they knew that the authorities would come for the leaders, especially, to be tried for treason in a legal war with the natives. And so they said, let's just march on the capital itself. So they took on the royally handpicked governor's militia, and they beat them. And the royal governor had to flee to the Caribbean for his life. Nathaniel Bacon declared a People's Republic of Virginia, but then he got dysentery and he died. And the movement started flopping, and a bigger army came from the Caribbean to squash them. Well, there are minutes of the assembly, the House of Burgesses, and the elected reps of the legislature of Virginia, whereby they were saying that they should use alternative sources of labor, that the indentured servants are too unpredictable and too volatile. And to a lot of people, what the word that is salient, that just jumps out, is expectations, right? Remember, from the very get-go, when they agreed to be indentured servants, they were promised land, to have learned to trade, supplies. They were told that that's just a stepping stone to what would become later known as the American dream. So they had high expectations. They were not the type of demographic that could just year after year be exploited and not do something about it. All right. So then that's around the 1670s. And then right at that time, the Portuguese made a treaty and got a further foothold into the Congo with the king of Congo. 2 tribes, I have them in here. I can't remember what tribes they are, but they're in here. 2 kind of kingdoms crumbled at this time, the same time. This timing was awful for African slaves. And then those around them, like parasites, came into those crumbling kingdoms, made war on them in their time of chaos, and took thousands of prisoners of war. Because they were getting lucrative trade, money, guns, etc., by going to the ports like Elmina and Luanda on the Ivory Coast and selling the slaves. So they come into the Caribbean, and there were factors that I don't recall with Trinidad and Barbados and Jamaica, whereby they didn't need nearly that number of slaves. So literally, the historian David Breon Davis, who's a pretty well-known historian on slavery, said that they experienced, I hate to use this term, he uses it because these are human beings, but a glut in the supply of slaves. There were way more slaves than there was official demand, desire and willingness and ability to pay for them. So when the supply outstrips the demand, what happens to the price? The price falls. So prices plummeted. Now the slaves are, quote, affordable. And then also, not long before this, the slave monopolies from the crowns of Europe were broken up, and they allowed free slaving to anybody who had the money to invest and go and try to put a hand in it. So it's like all this stuff is happening in such a horrible storm of chronological coincidence, whereby the white indentured servants are becoming fewer in number and becoming known as rebellious and non-desirable to work for you. And the number of slaves are blossoming, and their price has now become affordable. So I have here somewhere that at this point, it actually cost just 5 more pounds. Okay, I'm not sure where it is. Right here. A slave became only 5 more pounds than an average indentured servant, whose labor was commanded no longer than 7 years. And slave codes by the 1640s had ensured that such an investment for a slave, only $5 pounds more, was for life, and often entailed ownership of the slave's children as well. Right? So hence, I hate to say it, it became a bargain of getting more for your dollar. Paying that extra $5 seemed, the doing cost benefit analysis seemed to be worth it, every bit of it, to get them for life and their children. Then say some people that racism, you can't deny that racism was prevalent, was present across the Atlantic Ocean with the Europeans. You can't deny that. But this person is making the argument that in this book I read that that wasn't the primary reason, though. That the primary reason is what I just went over, that it was economic. And then racism was deliberately fomented, right? Remember, if you foment a fire, it's like as if the fire is about to go out, and you grab a blanket and feed oxygen to the fire to get it going again, right? You foment the fire. That racism may have been conveniently fomented by the leaders and the well-to-do planters as justification for enslaving Africans, and also as a divide and conquer tactic to keep the poor, rebellious white Virginians from teaming up with the Africans. Keep them divided. All right. So at any rate, then with number 5, racism was inherited as an integral part to English colonization. So now I did a 180, right? So the prior one was that, hey, it wasn't personal. It was just business. 5 is trying to say, no, man, slavery was salient. It was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. It was right up front for everybody to see at any given time. So I go back, and this is from Ibram Kendi. And Ibram Kendi is a real well-known contemporary African-American historian. You go to Aristotle and his climate theory about tropical people being lazier, being more creatures of habit and instinct, less inclined to be intelligent, morally lax, etc. Then you go forward from the Greeks and you go to the medieval time period. You had the Arabic writer Ibn Khaldun, and he kind of piggybacked off of Aristotle's climate theory about tropical people. And he wrote specifically that the sub-Saharan Africans were like dumb animals, naturally submissive to slavery as they remained remote from civilization. Then Portugal had a guy who had a famous book, Gomes Gerara. I probably butchered that. I don't know Portuguese. But it seemed to suggest innate African inferiority while calling for their evangelization. He likened the dark complexion of their faces to creatures burned in hell. He suggested that they had failed to develop an impressive culture. He attributed their nakedness to a childlike ignorance of morality, and he complained that Africans lived in bestial sloth. These are not glowing reports, right? The Portuguese became the primary source of knowledge on unknown Africa and the African people for the original slave traders and enslavers in Spain, Holland, France, and England. And then there was Leo Africanus. Supposedly this is a big one too. African men's hypersexuality, and that will show itself in the South of their absolute fear of black men raping white women. Destitution of reason, bestial or animal-like behavior. Okay, so all this. English writer George Best added to it and sent his writings to the colonies. John Pori translated these works into English, into early modern English. So they're deliberately, extending, perpetuating these terrible images of Africans. So what do you know? In 1630, a white man in Virginia named Hugh Davis was publicly whipped for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and shame of Christians by defiling his body and lying with a Negro woman. 10 years later, there was another episode of that. Then you have Antonio the Negro, or Antonio Johnson. This guy somehow earned his freedom as a slave, and he became a planter who owned slaves himself, a black man of African origin. So that definitely was anomalous. That was out of the ordinary. But it happened, right, with this kind of somewhat free economy. Well, he has himself a palatial home in Virginia, and he builds one in Maryland as well. So he goes during a holiday up to his Maryland estate, only to return to Virginia to have found that the local court has confiscated his property in Virginia. And of course, right, he had the common sense, the knowledge of his rights under English America and so forth to ask the right questions. He said, well, was I derelict on my taxes? No, sir. Okay, did I sign a lien or anything like that against my house? No, you didn't. Well, am I guilty of a crime? No, sir, you're not. We in the state of Virginia and the Commonwealth of Virginia have decided that it is not proper for a man of your color to own property. Just like that. Okay, so racism was here alive and well. And then the other one that I might mention is John Punch. John Punch ran away with 2 white indentured servants, and he was black. They were captured. The 2 white gentlemen had their remaining years of service doubled, and he was sentenced for life, separate from the other 2, simply because of his black skin. His name was John Punch. All right. Now, on the last few, a lot of this revolves around agency. Okay. Remember, that is people that in conflict history accounts seem to look like the victims, those who lost politically, economically, and socially, right? That we just want to elicit compassion for them, and the story ends there. Well, no, starting like in the 70s, this African American and other historians are like, no, we don't want, that's condescending. We don't want the story to stop there. We made decisions that mattered even when we were in seemingly powerless positions. We still had agency. We still had the ability of free will that could determine the course of events. All right. So here is pretty simple thesis by Peter Wood. I enjoyed reading it. Is South Carolina became terribly desperate for jobs that either they could not man or no one else wanted to do. Okay. A few of those jobs that are described in the book. One is there literally was a Carolina panther that was wreaking havoc on homes and villages, etc. So under duress, they dropped the normal Southern cultural axiom, right? Like assumption that you don't question, that you do not arm your slaves for obvious reasons. They armed their slaves and offered them money per pelt of these panthers. You also had the Yamasee and the other native tribes, along with the French, that were going through the Carolinas and abducting people and selling them in the Caribbean for profit. It was literally like human trafficking. And so they asked the African slaves to help protect their sons and daughters, etc. And again, in those cases, would oftentimes be willing to arm them in their desperation. And another one is they got a mandate from their leaders they were private leaders at first, wealthy guys from the Caribbean. This doesn't remain. It's going to be revoked and it becomes a royal colony, but not yet. So these private leaders make a mandate that they want so much tar and pitch available per year. The tar and pitch was the adhesive, the glue for ships to glue the wood together. Well, the tar and pitch came from evidently a very uncomfortable and even dangerous process of cutting into the bark of certain types of trees, collecting the sap, connecting it with a few other elements and boiling it. Oftentimes, it would burn the skin on your face, on your hands and arms, etc. It was a very unsavory job, and the slaves offered to do it. But they said, right, you see the word demanded there. They're no dummies. They saw that their masters were desperate for their labor. So they said, what's in it for us? If I'm willing to do this, what do I get? And there were a myriad of concessions. Some of them got to be reunited with their wives. Some got to have unlimited passes to leave to go see their loved ones off the plantation. Some of them were allowed to slowly collect their money and then pay for their manumission or their freedom. And some were given partial freedom, like the Dutch did to the slaves in New York, whereby at certain times of the year, they would come and engage in some type of labor for the master and then leave for the rest of the year to their own desires. All right, so that is Black Majority, the book. And number 7, this is boasting of the power of the Native American tribes in the lower Mississippi. And basically, it's a story of them bullying the French. They knew that the French were desperate for their military help and for their corn and food. And they played that to the best, like a card, like an ace up their sleeve. They played that card as well as they could out of their own self-interest. The case that I remember from that book that stood out to me was that they had not too prior to this had made an alliance, a military alliance with France, and then they began fighting. This was the Natchez, and it might even have been the Cherokee that they were fighting. And they said, "This is getting too bloody. And then they demanded much more from the French than was originally included in that treaty. They said, you need to step it up and give us more, or we're walking out as your allies." And the French were furious. They said, "No, you signed it. That's not in the contract." And the natives were like, "Too bad." And the French didn't do it and claimed that they didn't have the resources to give. And the natives stood their ground and left as their allies and left the French to fight the Cherokee alone. So you see case after case of Native Americans using the leverage that they had, namely, like I said, in weaponry and food, in dictating terms to the French. And also a subtopic to this, right, is the fact that we're speaking English right now and not French. The French just did not invest enough resources, enough settlers, enough soldiers, enough farmers to really be able to impose their will here in North America. All right. And then lastly, French Louisiana, fluid by accident. All right. So note in this one that it's called unintended consequences. Is at first, these French leaders were pre-French Revolution guys, right? So like the Bourbon family and so forth, like old school divine right, right? Like, wasn't it Louis XIV who said, "I am the state"? He told that to the parliament that he shut down. They were that old school way, known as the Ancien regime, the old regime prior to the Enlightenment and prior to the French Revolution, which was very, very inequitable. Remember, inequitable is primarily economically and also politically imbalanced, unfair. A small group, like an oligarchy, controls most of the wealth and land, has its hands monopolized on the power at the expense of the masses. Well, supposedly that's what these leaders wanted, desired to impose in French Louisiana. But they just didn't have enough resources to do it. So in fighting with the Native Americans, fighting against piracy, they could not institute a tough law against their soldiers for cohabitating and having children with Black and Native American women. So they begrudgingly acquiesced, gave in, and said fine to miscegenation, interethnic sex or marriage. Because that initially they wanted to kick them out of the army for doing such. But they needed them. They needed as many soldiers as they could. And then there was supposed to be 2 shipments a year coming from France to New Orleans. And several years, not a single shipment came. So Lacombe de Bienvais, I don't know how to say it. He was the governor. He writes this angry letter back to the crown and said, "I've been asking for shipments twice already. If we don't receive any by the spring, I'm going to open trade." And he said something to the effect like, hungry mouths care not the source, right? Like when you're desperate for goods, for food, you get to the point where you don't care if a Caribbean pirate offers that food to you. Food is food, and you need it. So then that's when you had these pirates, like Jean Lafitte and others who came into New Orleans, made themselves a name. Everybody knew their bad reputation for murder and theft, but they still were able to have the nicest seats in the theater, the nicest hotels to stay in, lots of fans following them around. And they brought in food and lots of necessities and coveted goods that were readily bought from the French inhabitants at New Orleans. And so then at that point, they stopped caring about papers for artisans as well. If you wanted to engage in some kind of skilled trade, you just did. You get this sense of like the disgust of these conservative French leaders. So they just throw their hands up and they just kind of give up. So it's interesting to me that some people would say, metaphorically, that the Ancien regime, the old king rules by divine right and all that, right? The aristocrats alone get to live the good life economically. That Ancien regime did not grow well in American soil, right? So almost by accident, people got to marry whom they wanted, do what they wanted for a living, participate in government, etc. So Louisiana became fluid, rise and fall by your own merit, but it was not intended. It was as if by accident. And keep in mind, look at that swath. That is the entirety of Louisiana. It's like 19 future states. It's a lot. Okay, so if you don't mind, now what I want to do is I want to get your names down to give you credit for this. I thank you for being here. All right, let's see here. And while I'm working on that, does anybody have any questions?
I had one. I was curious, is there any like specific book that you're reading out of? I know that there's footnotes on different places that you've taken your notes from and stuff. Or is that kind of where you're basing your a lot of your reading out of, is those books?
Yeah, you know what? The books that I'm reading are the ones that are cited in the footnotes at the bottom of the pages. And because as you'll see throughout the year, it adds up to quite a few books. I just didn't begin to know where to begin as far as giving you a single book to use. But uh, when I do use a textbook, just to give you a general narrative of the time period, the general topics that are discussed of that time period, the one I tend to use is Alan Brinkley, AlanBrinkley, and it's American History Connecting to the Past. And in this case, you would get a volume 1 that goes up through Reconstruction after the Civil War. And you would get, by all means, you could go all the way back to the 11th or 12th edition, and they haven't changed that much. And you could buy a cheap version probably online.
Okay, you said that was Alan Brinkley.
Brinkley.
All right. Yeah, I was reading through them. And it's like some of the stuff's kind of interesting, and I was like, I want to learn more and maybe read more on just specific points of it and stuff. So
Yeah, for sure. And if there's one that really does so on a very specific topic or even a specific perspective, uh, go to this sheet and look at the bottom and see what sources I cited. You may want to get your hand on one of those specific books.
yeah, okay. Thank you.
No problem. All right, give me just a second. Sorry, guys. Moving along a little slowly.
Another question I had, were the videos going to be posted online on Canvas?
Yes, yes, I will try to get on that tonight, okay?
All right.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's all right. I know you, a notice comes up saying that the recording's in process, and I wasn't sure if it was used, we could review it when we're going over the product, or if it was just for learning purposes or so.
Yeah, no, I intend to have that available, especially, I mean, for you guys as well to go back over it. But especially for those that, you know, have work, have something with their family where they just genuinely cannot make it.
Yeah.
And so I definitely want to try to help them.
Okay.
All right. So I will work on getting this and the last one put up tonight, okay? And
Cool.
then note that you'll just have one more assignment, the Northern Colonies, and then we'll have a test.
Okay.
Right. So do you guys feel okay? Did I leave you feeling a little bit better going into this? Please read all of them, but just analyze and evaluate one. Thank
I
you.
had a question, Professor.
Yeah.
In regards to the test, are we gonna be doing that via Zoom, or are we gonna be doing it on the Canvas, like
That's
multiple
right.
choice or written?
That's right. You'll be doing it on Canvas, on on your own computer, your own time. Um, and you go to quizzes
Oh, okay,
and
I
hit
see.
on test one. Yeah.
Is it gonna be like written ones, or is it gonna be the ones where basically we just bubble in what we think is right?
Yeah, it's the old school bubble in. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm not proud of that. I'm really not. But I have to cut corners as far as my time.
Yeah, I
It takes
understand.
enough time, you know, to read all your responses and think about, you know, what I think it merits, case by case. The numbers really add up. And so
Oh,
to be
okay.
honest, it's kind of a point of laziness on my time, on my part, of giving that old school format of multiple choice to you. So I
Yeah.
apologize, but I just felt like at some point I had to shave off some time.
Oh, no, no, you're good. No worries. In regards to the homework, basically it's all gonna be summed up, and basically with the three assignments that we have, where it's just gonna be a mixture of everything on the test, right?
That's right. And by
Oh,
all
catches.
means, have your argumentative handouts readily available in front of you on your desk when you take the test, because a lot can be extracted from them.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was gonna ask again. That was gonna be my next question, like basically like open notes, if that was gonna be okay with you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, really, when you think about it, I couldn't stop you if I wanted to. But even my in class kids, especially on the first test, I always allow them open note at least on the first test.
All right, that sounds good, Professor. Thank you.
All right, no problem. Okay, so anybody else before we close down for today? You guys hang in there, okay? This will be this method, this pedagogy that I have will be a piece of cake for you in no time. All right. So you guys have a great week, okay? Thank you, Kyle. I appreciate that, the feedback. You guys have a great week, okay? And take care. And thank you for my quick improvisation from 4 to 5 o'clock. I appreciate you making it nevertheless.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good one.
You too. Thank you.